History.
We shall never surrender.
Politics.
Where there is discord, may we bring harmony.
Current affairs.
Going to Pizza Express in Woking is an unusual thing for me to do.
Conspiracies.
Ask not what your country can do for you.
We'll stop terrorists from coming after us.
I just received a beautiful letter from Kim Jong-un.
It concludes that Iraq has chemical and biological weapons.
I'm not guilty of harassing anyone.
Well, I'm not a crook.
This is the Political Darkside Podcast. And now, here's your host, Matthew Howland.
If you only knew the power of the dark side.
Welcome to the latest episode of the Political Darkside podcast. A quick reminder to everyone to follow the show on social media and subscribe to the various feeds through politicaldarkside.com. On this episode, my guest is Mr. Bart Sibrel, an award-winning filmmaker, writer, and investigative journalist. He's basically the go-to guy on the moon landing conspiracy and the idea that humanity has not set foot on the moon. Bart's documentaries have been seen by millions on YouTube, and I've just finished reading his new book, entitled Moon Man, which is full of evidence and his personal story of investigating the fraud. Mr. Sibrel, welcome to the dark side. How are you?
I'm doing good, Matthew. How about yourself?
Yeah, great. Thanks. Great. I've just been listening to a lot of your podcasts and stuff because you've been doing the rounds on the various popular podcasts. You'll probably note that I'm in my kitchen here, so I haven't quite made it like some of...
Oh, can you make me a cheeseburger? You have a 3D scanner and printers you can send to me?
Sadly not. But yeah, no, it's been good to listen to you and your story and your work through these other podcasts. So I thought I'd reach out, and you've kindly agreed to give me some time today. So I probably first became aware of the moon landing conspiracy in about 1997, incredibly enough. As a child reading this magazine. It's called X Factor. We got it in the UK. I'm not sure if you guys got it in America as well.
It normally takes 20 years. You know, the Beatles were popular there first, and we get it a little bit later.
Yeah. It lays out quite a basic concept of the faked photographs and whatnot. But as I'm sure you will share with us, it's far more than just a few dodgy photos. At that age, I certainly enjoyed things like this, but the actual ramifications were lost on me. So now looking at your work, the implications of it are devastating. So my first question for you is, why the moon landing? Why have you decided to make this your life's work?
Well, it's not necessarily my life's work. It's more my most known my most known project, I guess. Thanks to Buzz Aldrin, for punching me. Hey, thank you so much. More people heard about it. Basically, I grew up like everybody else, thinking the moon landings are real. I mean, why should we doubt our government, right? And, it's odd, Matthew, the number one reason I hear from people who just won't accept the fact that the moon landings were fake is they say, well, the government wouldn't be so corrupt as to lie about such an important thing. And, the Kennedy assassination was done in front of 200 witnesses, and they still got away with it. You have 3,000 architects and engineers saying the 9/11 buildings could not possibly come down by a pinhole airplane. It's structurally impossible. And yet the moon landing had no eyewitnesses. A TV picture controlled by the government. They didn't even show live pictures during the landing. All of a sudden, this picture pops out, which could have been shot in someone's backyard at night with a spotlight, and people are on the moon, and if you say so, and people waved their flags and cried and thought so. And then trying to tell them otherwise is like taking candy away from a spoiled child. They will fight you to defend this product that is bad for them. And yeah, the ramifications are very serious. And that's why I wrote Moon Man. Because, a third of the book is kind of about how and why the moon missions were fake. A third of it is my behind the scenes, never before revealed espionage adventures, investigating it, including being kidnapped and drugged by the CIA. And the last third, and perhaps the most important third, is look, they did fake the moon landings. I just explained it, in 10 previous chapters. What does this mean? It means the people who run our country and the governments of the world are criminals. They're murderers. they're embezzlers, and they are still doing it now. They're at large. They're in charge right now. Isn't that significant? Isn't that relevant that the country, the CIA, which was tasked to protect the president, murdered them? That, people like Dick Cheney or whoever are, killing 3,000 people in one day without thinking about it and blaming it on somebody else. And that they had the audacity to claim that the greatest event of mankind, when in fact it was completely fictionalized. So I've been a filmmaker most of my life, and I thought from the age of 4, which is how old I was at the time, to 14, that the moon landings were real. I had pictures of them on my bedroom wall that I saw every day for 10 years. So I saw pictures of men on the moon, and I don't think anyone in the entire world can claim this, that they looked and worshiped pictures of men on the moon, Apollo 11, 3,650 times, and then had enough of an open mind to consider maybe they're not on the moon. So when I'm 14, I saw Bill Casey, a guy who worked for NASA through Rocketdyne for 6 years with high security clearances on television, saying the moon missions were fake. And so I'm a 14-year-old open-minded kid, and I'm like, oh, never thought about that. Let me take a look. And sure enough, you can see a straight line in some of the pictures between the real soil and the fake backdrops. And I'm thinking, that's kind of odd. And then the guy, famous picture with his arm bent, it has wrinkles all in it, and he's just leisurely holding it there at 90 degrees. When in the space station, when they do a spacewalk, they have to have metal joints because it's so pressurized they can't even bend their arm. And then I thought, well, how many wrinkles are in a balloon? There aren't any. And if that thing is pressurized, it would be, those wrinkles there. So another 10 years go by, I'd become a filmmaker. Now, remember, the job of a filmmaker is to make fake scenes look real. So I started, looking at these, and I said, oh, that's an umbrella light. I have those in the closet. I can even tell you what kind of lighting they use because I use the same thing and know exactly what it looks like. So I'm producing or editing a film one day for the guy who actually produced the show I saw 10 years earlier as a 14-year-old. And I'm like, what was that guy on your show who said we didn't go to the moon? He says, I don't remember. Call the office in San Francisco. I called them up. They said, had I called a couple of days later, they wouldn't be able to tell me because they were throwing away all 10-year-old files to make new room for new stuff. I called him up. He said, you're a filmmaker. You should make a film about it. And I studied it for about 6 months, shadows that should be parallel in sunlight or intersecting at 90 degrees, which is 100% proof of artificial light. I mean, you can prove the fake moon landings by that one picture. Just go to Sibrel.com. You can see it for yourself. And then 2 of the 3 astronauts on the famous mission don't give interviews, and the administrator of NASA resigns days before the first mission. And then the Soviets were first about everything and never attempted to go. I'm like, there's at least a 1 out of 4 chance that they didn't go. And I thought that's kind of large, really. I mean, if the cop said, there's a 1 out of 4 chance your next door neighbor is a homicidal maniac, you wouldn't go, well, it's only 1 out of 4 chance. No, that's kind of large. And so originally, believe it or not, Matthew, I turned it down the project. I thought, there's a sobering possibility they did fake it. I like puzzles. I have kind of a relentless, never give up personality. And I thought, well, if anybody could figure this out, maybe I could. And if they really didn't go, that could be dangerous. So at that time, I'm thinking I want to have a wife and family someday. Why should I risk my life for what Nixon did, 30 years earlier? So I turned down the project. Another 5 years go by. I was editing for another client who was a Christian musician. And they said, I'll get one of your scripts to a famous Hollywood producer if you do me a favor. I'm like, what favor? They wanted me to read the Bible. I'm like, oh, okay. So they got me like a 1-year Bible. It's basically the Bible divided into 365 daily reads. And I read that thing 5 times from cover to cover. Now, I wasn't a Christian afterwards, but it did convince me there is right and wrong. There is a God. Things don't make themselves. There is a judgment for how we live our life. And I realized that if they didn't go to the moon, they faked it, murdered people, murdered their own astronauts to cover it up, which is true. That's actually more profound historically than if they had actually gone. So this great truth that mankind is so deplorable, so prideful, so sinful, that they would fake the greatest event of mankind, that is true. And that's a truth that mankind needs to know. So I realized I'm going to die anyway, so I might as well die for a just cause. So I changed my mind. I started producing A Funny Thing Happened on the Way to the Moon, which was financed by a board member of an aerospace company who builds rockets for NASA, who knows that they're fake. And he thought it was his patriotic duty to give me $1 million to produce these movies. And I was producing them under the theory it might be true that they faked it. Well, 3.5 years into this 7-year project, I pop in a tape that says don't show to the public on the screen, and it's the same shot for an hour. And I'm like, well, why am I seeing this little blue ball of Earth floating around in space for an hour? It's because it's a special effects shot. They're doing it over and over again until they get it right. Well, we have this unedited version of them faking being halfway to the moon, dated 2 days into the flight, with the CIA on the third track of audio telling them how to do it. And I'm like, oh my gosh, they really didn't go to the moon. And I couldn't believe it. I just started crying. I'm like, oh, how pathetic of a world do I live in? And then I panicked. I have proof that they faked the moon landing in my house. I got a blind roommate and a 2-year-old son. What have I gotten myself into? And it was at that point all these weird espionage things started to happen. And so I want to get back to feature filmmaking. So I thought I'd write a book about it, which is on Kindle, print, and audio, and just kind of put this behind me, hopefully.
Yeah, the footage that you mentioned, it's certainly remarkable. I actually spoke to Richard Gage a few weeks back about 9/11, and it's certainly that it points to a long-term deception run by government forces on the general public. From what I gathered of your work, the main theory is that we have put equipment into space, certainly as far as the moon, but are unable to put people there. Is that correct? And from a scientific point of view, the main issue seems to be the Van Allen radiation belt. Can you explain what that is and why it's a problem?
Sure. There's a number of reasons that you can prove, mechanically that they didn't go to the moon. You can prove it logically. Let me start with that one. What they're claiming, is today with NASA's, best technology, which is 5 decades newer and more advanced than what they used to go to the moon. With all that newer, better technology, the farthest that NASA can send an astronaut from Earth is 250 miles. So they're saying they went 1,000 times farther on the first attempt with 1/millionth the computing power of a cell phone on the first attempt. So if you can show me any time in world history that a technological milestone was made and 50 years later, no one could even repeat it when it should be 10 or 100 times better, then I'll admit the moon landings are real. But the fact is, it's never happened before. So one of the reasons why they couldn't go, and most people don't know about this, is starting about 1,000 miles above the Earth and extending somewhere up to 30,000 miles thick is a field of radiation known as the Van Allen radiation belt. They did reports about this in Scientific American in the late 50s. They said it was lethal. They said it's an obstacle to leaving Earth orbit. They sent up Geiger counters into the thing, and the needles vibrated so fast that they broke. They did demonstration after demonstration that they could not go through this radiation belt. And we have, Moon Man, which you can get at Sibrel.com, is an interactive book. There are basically 15 video links. You go to Sibrel.com, and after reading the first chapter, I say, click on video link 1, and another chapter, click on this. One of the links is NASA's own scientist, Kelly Smith, saying, I think in 2014, that the radiation belt that surrounds the Earth is lethal, and that the technology to survive going through it has yet to be invented. So then how did the astronauts go through it? So when I call up the guy, to talk to him, they won't let me. And I said, well, I'm a journalist. He made this press video. Well, he doesn't give interviews anymore since he put his foot in his mouth. And I said, okay, you sent a probe, unmanned, of course, into the radiation belts, because you can X-ray a toaster 1,000 times. It'll still make toast, but you X-ray a human 1,000 times, I think they're going to drop dead from it. So they sent up these probes into the radiation belt specifically to measure the radiation. And I said, well, can I please have those radiation readings? And they said, oh, that's a classified secret. And I'm like, it's just a part of nature. I mean, NASA sent taxpayer-funded probes to the sun, and they told us how much hydrogen is in the sun. So the amount of hydrogen in the sun, it's not classified, it's just nature. They sent probes to Jupiter. How much helium is in Jupiter's atmosphere? The amount, it's not a classified secret, it's just nature. So why would the amount of radiation in the radiation belt that surround the Earth be a military classified secret? Unless, of course, they release the information and it proves that it's, 100, 1,000 times beyond a lethal level, which it is. And then the rocket to go to the moon had nowhere near amount of fuel. It's not my opinion. It's the rocket designer's opinion. He said in a publication, which I read in Astronauts Gone Wild and quote in the book, he said that to reach the moon nonstop in one rocket, like they claim to have done, in order to have enough fuel to do that, the rocket would weigh 800,000 tons. He said these numbers are irrefutable. The Saturn V rocket that they claim went to the moon weighed only 2,500 tons and compared to 800,000 tons. It's a difference of 30,000%. So for some reason, after Kennedy misspoke and said we're going to go to the moon by the end of the decade, 3 days later, his math changed by 30,000%, and then the lunar module. I mean, the idea that they could power that thing, at 250 or 500 degree heat on the moon and power it down, the air conditioning down to, 72 degrees on a bunch of car batteries for 3 days. That's not going to happen ever. And that's why they destroyed not only all of the moon landing equipment, they destroyed all the diagrams, all the blueprints. Now, think about this. Bill Gates, let's just imagine, he spent $200 billion to make the first computer, right? And because that's what the moon landing cost in today's dollars. And it works fabulous. And as soon as he's done, he takes the equipment, throws it into the furnace, and then takes all the diagrams on how it was built and throws that into the furnace too. That's what they did. NASA admits, and this is a clip in the book, NASA's astronaut Don Pettit says, we deliberately destroyed the technology to go to the moon. So why would you do that? I mean, the B-52 was built 70 years ago, and there's 200 of them still in service because nothing works better. So if they spent $200 billion, to go to the moon, you would never destroy that equipment. You would never destroy those designs. And yet, if you were perpetrating a fraud, that's exactly what you would do. So the fact that they destroyed the diagrams and the equipment is actually proof of the fraud. Because if you really went, you would never do that. And if you perpetrated a fraud, that's exactly what you would do.
Yeah, the rocket engineer you mentioned, you were speaking about Werner von Braun, right?
Mm-hmm.
So he obviously played a lead role on the Apollo project. His gravestone has a Bible passage referenced, which speaks of the idea of a firmament, which is the solid dome supposedly created by God over the earth. Do you think that's significant that would appear on his gravestone?
I'm not sure what the significance of that is. Some people use that to claim that the earth is flat, which it's not. The fact is, when people in the Bible were describing how they, viewed the sun and its movement, that was as they saw it. Solomon said that his wife's eyes were like lilies and her lips were rubies. Does that mean she had, her lips were made of rubies? No, it's a metaphor for it. You can prove scientifically, and I think this was proven, 2,000 years ago, that someone knew the diameter of the earth 2,000 years ago within a few miles by the length of a shadow difference between two cities, proving the curvature of the earth. What he means by that is probably something different, that it's virtually impossible with today's technology to leave Earth orbit, which it is. Because if they could go to the moon on the first attempt with 1960s technology, they would have been on Mars 10 years later. We'd be in another solar system by now, and there'd be bases all over the moon. I mean, it makes no sense. It's like Lindbergh flies across the Atlantic in 1927, and 50 years later, no one can do it. No nation on Earth, including the nation who built the first airplane. No, it's not the case. 10 years later, there were thousands of aircraft flying over the Atlantic. 100 times more complicated. After they blew up the first atomic bomb, 10 years later, they're 1,000 times more powerful. So surely, if they could go to the moon so easily with 1/1,000th the computing power of a cell phone, think how advanced space travel would be today. It's the only time in the history of the world that technology went backwards. And seeing how it's impossible for technology to go backwards, it means the moon landings were fake.
Yeah, my interpretation of it wasn't along the lines of a flat Earth thing. It was more of a, he's telling us in a roundabout way that as things stand, we are trapped on the planet.
Yeah, I mean,
radiation belt.
Neil Armstrong kind of made a same kind of cryptic message on the 25th anniversary of the event. And I was working for NBC News at the time. I was able to get a satellite feed of it and include it in the film. He said, with tears welling up in his eyes, to a group of high school students touring the White House on the 25th anniversary, he said to them, maybe someday, regarding the moon landings, you'll be able to remove one of truth's protective layers. And he had the common sense not to swear in the Bible that he walked on the moon. Michael Collins had the common sense not to do it. And Buzz Aldrin had the common sense not to do it. They know they'd be making an oath that could later, bite them in the butt. That's why when George Bush and Cheney, testified about, what they knew about 9/11, they said, we'll be glad to do so as long as it's not under oath. I mean, that right there should tell you that they're involved somehow. Because if the only way they can testify about it is if they have permission to lie, then that means they're covering something up. I mean, it's so obvious, it's mind-boggling.
Yeah, absolutely. It's certainly, like you mentioned about the exposure to radiation for astronauts like Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin, that they haven't, succumbed to some form of deadly cancer or something if they did go through the Van Allen radiation belt.
Well, yeah, I mean, they'd be dead in a few days, according to the calculations which are laid out mathematically, in Moon Man, which you can get at Sibrel.com. All of this is laid out. There is so much more proof that the moon landings are fake than they are real. And anyone with an open mind who watches a funny thing happen on the way to the moon, 4 out of 5 of them reverse their opinion. I got an email from a guy today saying, I'm about, a quarter into the book. My eyes are beginning to open. And all you have to do is have an open mind. That's it. The film A Funny Thing Happened on the Way to the Moon opens up with a scripture. It says, pride comes before a fall. The Bible says that pride prevents you from seeing the truth. So what is pride? Pride is simply the unwillingness to be wrong, just as humility is the willingness to be wrong. I talked to a professor of an aerospace department of a major university, and I asked him, to consider these facts that the moon landings were fake. He said, there's nothing I could ever say. No proof could ever exist to convince him that the moon landings were fake. And I said, okay, what if you saw Neil Armstrong on national TV crying and confessing, I'm so sorry, please forgive me, the moon missions were fake? And he said, I still think they went to the moon. I mean, this is a guy who's a professor teaching aerospace. Is that really intelligence? I wonder.
No, that's not an ideal position to take, is it?
No.
The astronauts walking on the moon, your idea, well, it states in your book that it was actually filmed in an army-based studio with President Lyndon Johnson present. Can you elaborate on how that was done and how you can tell it's not the moon?
Yeah, I mean, it's mind-boggling what happened. Basically, around the time of the 50th anniversary, when there was all this publicity, I think I did an interview about it on HBO. Someone saw it and came forward. Now, the information that I got was from a person who was there when they filmed Apollo 11. He told us the dates, June 1st, 2nd, and 3rd of 1968. He told us the name of the military base, which you'll have to get a copy of the book to find out. He gave us the CIA code name for the project. He gave us a list of VIP eyewitnesses who were there at the time, some of whom are still alive. He was a military police officer, chief of security at this military base. He stood beside President Johnson while they filmed it. And interestingly, President Johnson was eligible to run for re-election in 1968, and he refused. his own party could not understand. You're popular. You'll win. Why won't you run for president of the United States when you're eligible? Because during that term, they would be faking the moon missions. And who knew that would work? Might work, might not. Can you imagine being from Texas, where Johnson Space Center is, and being president when they faked the moon landings and getting caught? He had nothing whatsoever to do with that. And that's why Richard Nixon didn't show up for the launch. He showed up for something like Apollo 14, after they had already faked going to the moon successfully 2 or 3 times. Why would the president of the United States, when they're going to the moon for the very first time, not be there in the bleachers? It makes no sense whatsoever. Oh, sure, after they got away with it 3 or 4 times, he finally shows up because he didn't want any historical record of him being there shaking the astronaut's hand, and in case it later, blew up in his face. He just wanted to literally distance himself from it, as did Johnson, and that's why he didn't run for re-election.
Yeah, I've just done a quick Google search there, and it looks like Robert Kennedy was actually assassinated the same week that they would have filmed the moon landing in the base then, because he gets killed on June the 6th, 1968.
Oh, did he? I thought it was in January. I was mistaken.
Let me just double check that. But
yeah, I thought it was in California right after the Democratic primary.
No, June the 6th, 1968.
Thanks for the correction. That's pretty weird.
That's remarkable, actually, when you put all that together.
And, it's amazing. Everything improves over time. I mean, how you cook McDonald's French fries, the starter in your car, evil improves over time, too. So what happened was, in regard to the Kennedys, Kennedy, got elected with some shenanigans, probably from his father doing something with the vote in Chicago, probably. And they figured, he owed the deep state a favor. Then when he wanted to literally abolish, disassemble the CIA, disassemble the Federal Reserve and have the government print their own money, they're like, this guy's out of control. And he dies like 6 weeks after signing those orders. So they got him while he was president. Then they knew what Bobby Kennedy was like. I'm sure, suspected if he had become president, he was going to investigate the murder of his brother, right? So they killed the first Kennedy when he was president. They killed the second Kennedy when he was running for president. And then the guy's poor son is just thinking about running for Senate, which would lead to the presidency. And they killed him when he was just thinking about entering public life. And so, not only did they get away with killing Kennedy in front of 200 eyewitnesses, right? Then they get away with, doing 9/11, and 3,000 architects and engineers say that's rubbish, their excuse for the buildings collapsing. And then they're doing this little thing over the last 2 years, and they're improving. Their evil is improving every time. And their goal, and their cronies' goal, is to depopulate us by 93%. So if you have a room of 34 people, they want to get rid of 32 of us. They have said so, So, and it looks like they're well on their way to achieving their goal. And if anybody cares, you should read Moon Man. And when you realize that they really did fake the greatest accomplishment of mankind, you'll realize that they need to be stopped. And, something I discovered along the way, Matthew, is, even though the moon landing fraud probably killed the fewest people of most of these government frauds. I mean, something like 200 eyewitnesses of the Kennedy assassination were murdered, or maybe it wasn't high, but some pretty high number. Only about probably 15 people were killed to keep this secret, At the same time, if the truth came out about the moon landing being a fraud after they printed it on coins and stamps, put it in the encyclopedia, taught it in every school, people cried, they prayed, they waved their flag, they gave them congressional medals of honor for lying. Our heroes are liars. If that comes out, even though it killed the fewest number of people, I think it will have the most impact to institute government change. And that's why there's so many videos on the internet, to reassure us that, yes, the moon landings are real. Because if you type in, moon landing fraud, you don't get that. You get why the moon landings are real. If you type in a funny thing happened on the way to the moon, you don't get my film. You get a film saying I'm wrong. My point is, if they really went to the moon, Matthew, then anyone who says otherwise is an idiot. So why would they make 1,000 videos that took tens of thousands of hours and millions of dollars of cost to reassure a bunch of idiots that the silly idea that they have that the moon landings were shot in a TV studio was false? It makes no sense. If I said Mickey Mouse was the first president, you think there'd be 1,000 YouTube videos saying, no, George Washington? It should speak for itself, but they protest too much.
Yeah. The point you made there about if it ever came out, it would, lead to government collapse. I'm going to disagree with that. I think what would actually probably happen in the current climate with the Mockingbird media is that they would probably release the information and say it was justified in stopping Russia, much the same way that the certain elements of the American intelligence system have recently said we are justified in lying about what's happening in Ukraine so that we can, attempt to remove Putin as a long-term ruler. So
the fact is, Matthew, murderers have a reason why they kill.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Thieves have a reason why they steal, and liars have a reason why they don't tell the truth. And if they faked the moon landing and never killed anybody in the process, you might be right. However, you're wrong for the following reason. It's not my opinion what I'm about to tell you. It's the opinion of the dead astronaut's widow and the opinion of the dead astronaut's son, who's a 747 pilot. Most people don't know, but the crew that would have been the first crew to walk on the moon were murdered January 27th, 1967. The day before he was murdered, the commander of the mission, just sitting in the rocket, no engines ignited, just sitting there doing a rehearsal, right? He tells his wife the previous day, for some strange reason, the CIA is all over the rocket equipment today. Wonder why that is. And the very next day, he's burned alive. His own widow and his own son says he was murdered by the CIA. Now, why would the CIA murder the crew that would have been the first crew to walk on the moon? Well, because he was a whistleblower. He was preparing congressional reports about the ineptitude of NASA, that they were 10 or more years away from going to the moon, not 2, all of which was confiscated from his house by the CIA before they even told his widow that he was dead. In the door, grabbed the stuff out the door, didn't say a word to her. So, not only would the American public realize that, yes, the moon landings were fake and we took $200 billion of your money to do it, we also murdered your brothers and your fellow citizens who were going to expose our crimes. That's why the government doesn't want the truth to come out about the moon landing fraud. Not only would it be their greatest embarrassment of all time, it would also reveal that they murdered their own government employees, their own citizens, to keep it a secret. And if you think about it, one next step, you have to realize that these people, the CIA, who, the astronaut witnessed there at NASA messing with the rocket for some reason, those people were paid by you and me. They were paid by 1/3 of our labor, which is taken by the Internal Revenue Service and given to people like NASA, right? And they used some equipment. They used some wiring and, espionage, and we paid for that. They took our money. They took our money not only to deceive us about the moon landings, they took our money and used it to murder our fellow neighbors, brothers, and citizens who were going to expose their crimes. So when that comes out, I don't know if I would call it the collapse of the government. I would say it would cause a restructuring of the government. And my philosophy is, if a copper wire can, accept electrical flow through it from the left to the right, then it can accept it from the right to the left. So this whole idea that there's this top-down government, do what we say in Washington to the state of California, do what we say from the governor in Sacramento to the mayor of Los Angeles, do what we say from the mayor of Los Angeles to the, subdivision, and then the subdivision tells the owner of the house that they can't grow a garden in their own front yard because it doesn't look good. That needs to be completely reversed. the owner of the property should have supremacy, right? The community guidelines, or whatever you want to call it, the resident association should have no right whatsoever to tell him what he can plant or not plant in his front yard. And then the mayor shouldn't be able to tell the resident association to do. They should have supremacy over the mayor. The city may be a gun-free zone, and if the resident association wants to have everyone carrying a sidearm mandatory, then that's their right. Or in reverse, if the city allows guns, but they don't want to allow them in that resident association, then that's their right. And then the governor of Sacramento, who doesn't even live in Los Angeles, shouldn't be telling the Los Angeles mayor how to run a city. And then this guy in Washington, D.C., which isn't even a state, shouldn't be telling the governor of California what to do. It's all backwards, you know? So it's like trickle-down economics is to give millionaires tax breaks so they can hire more butlers to help the butler class. Well, instead of giving $3 trillion to the bankers who screwed up the economy and giving, all the citizens $1,000, according to my math, you could have given every citizen over 18 $20,000. And what would they do? They'd go out and buy cars and washers and dryers, which would trickle up to the millionaires. So who really needs the money more, millionaires or people working for $10 an hour? I wonder. So, this whole way that the government works is completely backwards. And I think this, if this came out, the government hopefully would be restructured that way, in the right way.
Yeah, we can but hope. I mean, there's a multitude of problems that are coming out of the governments at the minute. We've gone off on a bit of a tangent there, though. I mean, I do enjoy reading the story of the Apollo 1 fires with Gus Grissom and then hanging the lemon on the rocket prior to launch to describe its capabilities is quite a potent point to make. It is an important event in the 60s. It's probably often gets overlooked by the other things that have happened, such as the various assassinations of JFK, RFK, Martin Luther King, Malcolm X, Marilyn Monroe, the Vietnam War's happening. The more I read about the 60s, the more every major event seems to be highly questionable, but somehow it's all connected. The Cold War's rumbling along. So if there was no practical purpose in going to the moon or doing anything once there, or colonizing it, or creating a base, or any weapons-based uses, why did America and the Soviet Union spend so much money on what amounted to fake bragging rights? Well, it's just competition. I remember going to my first Chinese buffet that had all-you-can-eat crab legs. I was so excited, even though, crab legs are bad for you, it says so in the Bible, but didn't know that at the time. And then once one Chinese restaurant had it, they all had to have it, the next one and the next one. And the same thing in reverse. When one stopped having it because it was too expensive, then the other, now no one does it anymore. So they're just, competition. What you're saying, Matthew, is there is, and it's very insightful and it's very poignant what you said. There's a common thread to all the major events in the 1960s. The common thread is that the same criminals are doing all of those major activities. The same criminals, the CIA, deep state, whatever you want to call them, George Bush Sr., more than likely somewhere in there, he faked the moon landing. He was part of that. He was part of the Kennedy assassination. He was part of faking the Gulf of Tonkin, which led to the death of 1 million people, which John McNamara, Defense Department Secretary, now says they just made that up. It never happened, and that led to the death of 1 million people. And 9/11, and killing Bobby Kennedy, killing Martin Luther King Jr., it's the same, 8 to 10 year period where all of those events happened. And so, they're the same people who are ingrained there. There are generals in the Pentagon who have been there 40 years. And what was this? This was just 10 years of their shenanigans. And so this is what we have. But they're passing on their techniques, to future generations. It's like what McDonald's does today, how they cook their fries and hamburgers, the efficiency or whatever, is passed on to them from previous generations of McDonald's managers and owners. And so this little, scenario we've been going through for the last 2 years, that only happened so well and so powerfully, and it's because they've been passing this on, this, evil methodology of how to, have a corrupt government and get away with it, embezzle money, and lie to everyone you're being paid for to tell the truth. That has been passed on and refined, so that it's only better and better and better over time. And that's alarming.
It's not that your neighbor is a homicidal maniac. It's now that every neighbor is a homicidal maniac. And they used to have pistols, and now they have machine guns. And that's our government and most governments of the world.
Yeah. As an aside on evil, the 1980 film The Shining, directed by Stanley Kubrick, the little boy in the film's got a NASA Apollo jumper on. Kubrick's long been rumored to have been involved in the moon landing filming. It doesn't crop up in your book, though. Is that a route you've gone down?
Well, I didn't mention it in the book because it's kind of a side tangent. It's kind of irrelevant to me who faked the moon landings. What's relevant is that they were faked. Now, my personal opinion is that he did do it. I mean, they had two choices. They did fake the moon landing, so they have to have somebody in charge of faking it. They could have chosen, let's say, the general of the media department at the Pentagon, who normally shoots recruitment commercials, and they'd have great security, but completely amateur results. Or they could hire the best filmmaker on the planet and worry about security later, but have the short-term benefit of getting good-looking pictures and realistic pictures. Now, that had to be their choice. And what a coincidence. Apollo 11 was filmed a year earlier in 1968. And what was Stanley Kubrick doing in 1968? Making a film about going to the moon, 2001: A Space Odyssey. Then he later, for his film Barry Lyndon, which was the first feature film shot entirely with natural light, to pull that off, he had to have the most technologically advanced lens ever made, which was made by NASA, and he was the first filmmaker they ever gave it to. Wonder how he arranged that deal. And then you point out, in The Shining, that there are these little clues that Kubrick left. That's absolutely true. The most obvious one is the little red rum boy. When he gets up, in one scene, he's got on a shirt that says Apollo 11. It's not a t-shirt you get off the rack. It's a hand knit shirt that Kubrick deliberately put on him, to say that. There's many other, clues in that movie that are indicating to me that he faked the moon landing. And another one most people don't know about is his last film, Eyes Wide Shut. It's like I'm looking at those pictures 3,650 times, and I still don't see the truth until someone brings it to my attention. My eyes are wide shut. Well, there's a message in that, in the title and in what I'm about to tell you. Kubrick stipulated in his contract with that production company distributor in Los Angeles, he insisted that film be opened on a particular day. They didn't know why, but he wouldn't sign the contract until he agreed to it. They agreed to it, and he signed it. That day was July 16th, 1999, the 30th anniversary of the launch to the moon. Eyes wide shut. And he died beforehand. He died at the age of 70, and a lot of early people I found who were astronauts or whistleblowers were all dying around the age of 70, people who knew the truth. Like that was some retirement age they, assassinated you at so you wouldn't grow old and get senile or have cancer and not want to make a deathbed confession like my source did, who told me that he was there when they faked the moon landing. He said that because he was dying, and he was so guilt-ridden his entire life, he finally confessed it. And it's quite chilling. I mean, I already knew the missions were fake. I had more than enough proof they were fake. A 90-degree shadow photograph from the moon proves they were fake. Classified tape proves it was fake. All these weird things happening proves it was fake. And then, even after knowing all of that, when someone tells you, and I was there while it happened, and I'll tell you when, where, and how, it just throws another glass of water in your face, another chill down your spine. It's like, ugh. It's like having that first revelation when I popped in the tape that said, do not show to the public, and I saw the fake footage of them going to the moon. It just broke my heart all over again. It's just weird. I turned on CBS News, to watch the first, summary, 30-second summary to see what they're lying about this week. That must have been maybe a year ago. And they're going, the lead story, Matthew, is about why pregnant women, before the drug is even FDA approved, need to immediately go out and get an injection for an illness they don't even have. And I'm thinking they're telling pregnant women to get an experimental medicine before it's approved by the FDA, and it's the lead story. CBS Evening News, welcome. Picture of a pregnant woman's stomach. they need to go out and immediately get the shot. And then of course there are reports that I don't know that I can say on whatever venue you're posting this video that show that ended up not being a good idea for the unborn child.
I'm guessing you've also managed to survive so far without taking it.
So far so good.
Yeah.
I'm planning to travel, and I may have to find the safest one in order to do that. I mean, it is what it is. The evil people run the world. I don't. And in order to flee America, which I need to do because it's a sinking ship going down fast. And, if you know anything about the Pentagon's Deagle report that shows the population of the U.S. in just 2.5 years being somewhere between 70 and 85% less than it is now. And coincidentally, that's the same number of percentage that got the, injection of the medicine for an illness they didn't have. And other countries show a population increase, in 2.5 years. So my plans is to move to one of those countries. And I advise other people to start considering that, or either move into the country, with 500 pounds of beans in a way to protect them, because, bad things are coming. They've even told us so, and not so many words. There were the, mysterious inklings of Kubrick, the hint of Neil Armstrong, Truth's protective layers, von Braun's little mysterious, we can't leave Earth orbit on his tombstone. We now have Janet Napolitano on her last day in office warning Americans of the following. She said, "A natural disaster is likely on its way, the likes of which the United States has never before seen. Whoever follows me in office is going to need a big bottle of Tylenol to deal with it." That's what she said. So there's actually 3 important clues in this, Matthew. Number 1, what is coming is a natural disaster. Number 2, it's a natural disaster that has never happened in the 245 history years of America. And third, and most interestingly, it's a natural disaster that you could know about years in advance. So think about that. The America in 245 years, we've seen volcanoes and earthquakes and tidal waves and so forth and so on. And you certainly couldn't predict an earthquake or a volcano years in advance. What natural disaster has never happened in America, and a natural disaster that you could somehow know is coming years in advance? It has to be something from outer space because of the mathematics of being able to predict asteroids and comets, or even a rogue planet. So I think this little scenario they've been doing for the last 2 years to basically trick people into taking this medicine for an illness they don't have, which according to the former VP of Pfizer is going to lower the population by a significant amount. If this cosmic event is coming, I believe this decade, then that could potentially kill half the people on the earth in 6 months. So I think the people who run the world don't want that shock. They want to be able to travel and go to hotels and so forth. So what they're doing is a pre-burn. They're going to lower the population in their minds in incremental ways so that when that cosmic event happens, it'll be less of a shock to society. We'll kind of be prepared for it. So that's why I think they've been giving out this medicine to people, is to, take care of those people who they see is going to die anyway, so that they can control, the population reduction when the cosmic event happens. And I believe it's likely to be this decade.
That is obviously something that desperately concerns me, but I try and put it to the back of my mind as best as possible. It
really needs to be in the front of our minds. That's like, well, I've got cancer and 30 days to live. I'll put that in the back of my mind. No, it should really be in the front of our mind. Who do I need to ask forgiveness of? Who do I need to restore things to? What last things do I want accomplishment while I'm here? Maybe I need to get right with God, so that I have the hope of living past this life. So really, these are the most important things we need to be thinking about. Our government, didn't tell us the truth about who killed Kennedy, or 9/11, or the moon landing, or this little scenario they've been doing for 2 years. So they're certainly not going to tell us the truth if a comet, asteroid, or rogue planet is heading our way. Most importantly, people need to get right with God so they have the hope of grace and living beyond this life, because God is not going to let homicidal criminals like the people who run the world live forever. And so they're going to face judgment too. And that dawned on me, when I changed my mind out of fear of making my movies about the moon landing fraud to realizing I'm going to die anyway. It's a just cause, and the world needs to know the truth.
Yeah, there was the most recent series of the X-Files, I think, where a lot of what you just said was actually laid out, and the X-Files and Chris Carter in particular does have a history of involvement with the CIA. There's that infamous 9/11 episode which comes out in March 2001 about a hijacking hitting the World Trade Center, and he's spoken openly in interviews that he would speak to people at the Pentagon and the CIA about plotline ideas. So that's obviously something concerning in much the same vein as what we say Stanley Kubrick did. Sorry, on you go.
Oh no, I wasn't going to say anything. I'm just with you. Yeah.
To try and get us back to the moon after that tangent, and to stay on the idea of films. Everything that you've outlined here today, that how the fraud was completed, the behavior of the astronauts, the attempt at silencing your investigation, which we've kind of touched on, but I'd recommend reading your book to find out about that. It was actually reproduced in Hollywood a mere 6 years after Apollo 17 with the 1978 Hollywood film Capricorn One, starring Elliot Gould, James Brolin, and O.J. Simpson. They clearly had NASA cooperation with the sets and the equipment. By the mid-70s, were people already suggesting that the moon landing was faked, or did this film essentially start the conversation at the same time as being a way to debunk people questioning the official story?
Well, they did a survey prior to the moon mission, a week or a month or something like that, and already 10% of the public thought that they were going to fake it. And so Bill Casey, who, talked to me and opened my eyes to the fact that the moon missions were indeed falsified, who was a, firsthand eyewitness of it, he wrote a book called We Never Went to the Moon, and that was kind of the plot line of the film Capricorn One, which is a fantastic movie, whether they went to the moon or not. And, NASA has never cooperated with the production of any film except that one, which is really interesting because if you read the back sleeve of the DVD, it says the only space film ever produced with NASA's full cooperation. Well, it's kind of odd, isn't it? They're cooperating with a film about a fake space mission, which is obviously a parody of the fake moon missions. Well, if they don't cooperate, they might look guilty, so they cooperated so they wouldn't look guilty. I mean, the film is about a fake Mars landing because they didn't want to insult anybody, but they used a lunar module on the set, and it's pretty much the same thing, except Bill originally thought that they never were even on the rocket, and I said, well, they had to be for a number of reasons. One, they could go up in front of eyewitnesses and then splash down in front of eyewitnesses and have zero gravity of the tuna fish sandwich floating by. And then, if there was any problem and the rocket blew up, they wouldn't have to, put a bullet in the head of the astronaut. So the book was based on that scenario where they weren't even on the rocket. But the footage I uncovered proves that they were in Earth orbit. They just never left Earth orbit. And what a surprise, 50 years later, they still can't leave Earth orbit. It's mind-boggling. I write in the book, it's like Toyota claiming they built a car in 1969 that could go 50,000 miles on 1 gallon of gasoline. And 50 years later, the best car can do 50 miles per gallon. I'm like, how is that possible? Well, it must mean the original claim is false. Well, duh. And so if they can go 1,000 times further with 1969 equipment than they can today, well, then it means the 1969 equipment was a forgery.
Yeah. From what I gathered at the time, people in the 70s, that is, people had kind of zoned out from the moon stuff. Like in the Tom Hanks Apollo 13 film, a big part of the story is that the television at the time wasn't even showing the mission due to the general public's boredom at a third moon landing in 10 months.
Well, that's why they did Apollo 13, to add drama and get the public interest again. I mean, 13 is a big Illuminati number. So get this. Apollo 13 launched on April 13th. And then at 13:13 military time, they have this accident. I mean, they're just jerking people around and just smiling, all the way to the bank and, of course, to hell on the way because they think they're being clever. Yeah, after they went to the moon once, that's it. I mean, it's like if we were watching TV right now, Matthew, and they're planting the flag at the South Pole for the very first time, we would stop. and watch it. And then if 6 months later they're doing it a second time, we're not watching, we're continuing our interview. And so when they went to the moon for the second time, Apollo 12, and no one was interested, they're like, oh, we need more money. We got to keep going to the moon. What can we do to get people interested? We've got to have life or death jeopardy. So unlucky 13 on April 13th, a launch at Apollo 13 at 13:13 military time is pretty comical. If they had killed nobody, I would be laughing. But unfortunately, they did kill people to keep it a secret. My source, I don't even mention it in the book because I was like debating whether to reveal his name, whether to reveal what I'm telling you. I'm not going to say exactly who did it, but he knew of a coworker who was murdered because he was going to blab about the moon landing being fake. So we know that they were killed. We know the 3 astronauts were killed. The Fox special that originally Fox was going to air, a funny thing happened on the way to the moon. Their legal department freaked out. So they produced, conspiracy theory, did we go to the moon? They bring out another 6 or 7 Apollo astronauts, backup crews who died of accidents within all of a 2.5 year period. I mean, there's only like 24 astronauts and 7 of them died of accidents, in 2.5 years. Oh my goodness. What's going on here? And so, yeah, it's going to be heartache for the truth to be known, but it would also bring about the greatest number of changes in our government. And the government doesn't want the truth to come out because it's so embarrassing and because they're immediately going to start looking into all the astronauts who died who wouldn't participate in the fraud. And then it's going to prove not only are our government liars, they're murderers as well.
Yeah, the astronauts, generally their behaviors something to behold, certainly in your documentary Astronauts Gone Wild. Edgar Mitchell is a curious person. Obviously, he threatens to have you killed at one point. And he's pretty adamant that UFOs and aliens exist. How do you account for that?
Well, I mean, it's very simple to account for it. If the guy who says the moon landings are real when they're not, says aliens are real, then they're not. I mean, I was in a hotel a while back doing an interview about the moon landing. They put me up in a hotel, so I'm flipping through the HBO movies. Well, there's 10 movies. 3 of them are about aliens from outer space, 33% of them. So I'm like, okay, if 3 of the 10 films were about how great the president is, or 3 of the films were about how terrible the president is, obviously it's propaganda. So why is the government so much want us to believe in aliens from outer space? It's because there are no aliens from outer space. You can go to Sibrel.com and scroll down to my articles. Are there really aliens in outer space? And you can read a beautiful book, which is linked, The Privileged Planet, that can prove mathematically that life should not even exist on Earth. It's like winning the Powerball lottery 20 times in a row. There's a great TED talk of the guy says, there is no mathematical evidence to support life elsewhere. We're it. It even says so in the Bible. Revelation 21:3 says that when the new heaven and the new earth are made, and the saved people who made Jesus the Lord of their life are living there, God will personally dwell with us. Now, it says numerous times in the Bible that God does not show partiality. So if there's life on other worlds and he's dwelling with us, then he's showing partiality. The only way he could dwell with us and not show partiality is if we're it. So what a coincidence. Whatever the government wants you to believe is the opposite of the truth, right? That's always been the case. And it's about aliens too.
Yeah. Regarding the government, I found it interesting that there's actually a federal law that makes it illegal to own a piece of the moon. It's quite an interesting story about the woman arrested. I think it was in California for trying to sell a rock that was given to her by Neil Armstrong.
It's not even a rock. It's a tiny speck of moon dust, right? Mm-hmm. So her husband worked at NASA, knew Neil Armstrong. Neil Armstrong gave, him a little speck of dust that allegedly came from the moon. It's encased in this, like dome, paperweight type of thing. And she wants to sell it, to make some money, pay her bills. And she's surrounded by the FBI. I mean, why? Why is one particle of the moon? Why is the government so concerned that someone will cut into that plastic and put it under a microscope? Well, after I made a funny thing happened on the way to the moon, and some curator in Holland watched it, he realized in his own museum is this rock. Now, mind you, this rock, Neil Armstrong said he personally picked up off the surface of the moon, personally put it in his pocket, and personally is giving it to the Prime Minister of Holland. They take it, they put it in the glass, it sits there, for 45 years, however long it is. The guy watches my movie, and he's like, huh. So, without asking permission, he opens the thing up that they figured would never be opened, puts it under a microscope, and it's petrified wood. Now, it looks, really strange, so it must be a moon rock. Well, unless trees are growing on the moon, it's a forgery. It even made, this little sidebar notes on AOL News, moon rock proven to be a fake. But does anyone ask if the moon rocks are fake? What about the moon missions? They publish articles. In fact, CNN said when the space shuttle went to its highest altitude ever, which I think was 365 miles, which is still, like 650 miles away from the beginning of the radiation is so strong that if you close your eyes, you can see it as fireworks of radiation hitting the retinas of your closed eyes. That's how, you can imagine if you're in a city and there's a meltdown 650 miles away, you close your eyes and turn that direction and you can see the radiation hitting the retinas of your closed eyes. That's pretty powerful radiation. You're not even in the middle of it, right? So CNN issued a report in 1994. I was working for NBC at the time, grabbed it off the satellite feed, put it in my movies. They said the following word for word, quote, "The radiation belt surrounding the Earth is more dangerous than previously believed." Well, previously believed is when they went to the moon and back, allegedly, 6 times through the thing. So how can astronauts 650 miles away from it know more about it than astronauts who were supposed to be in the middle of it 6 times going to the moon and back, right? No one asks, well, how is that possible? Well, it means they never went to the moon. No one asks when Kelly Smith, a NASA employee, says it's posted all over the internet, the technology to survive going through the radiation belt has yet to be invented. No one asks, well, then how did the astronauts go through the moon? I think it was like something on the 30th anniversary. The Washington Post calls me up and says, hey, we want to do an interview about these fringe group of Americans who stupidly think the moon landings are fake. What have you got to say for yourself? I'm like, oh, here you go. I sent the guy a copy of the movie, and I asked him, what did he think? He said, well, it's scary. I said, well, what do you think about that window shot of them faking being halfway to the moon? He says, well, I can't explain that. I said, don't you think you should be able to explain it? He says, yeah. And I said, well, instead of writing a story about how interesting it is that, 25% of the population thinks the moon landings are fake, what about writing a story, seeing how you broke Watergate, about how maybe the moon missions really were fake? And he said, well, if I did that, I would be fired. Isn't that interesting? I showed the tape to an NBC news director, the tape of them faking part of the mission right in front of your eyes. He turns pale white, collapses in his seat, puts his hand over his mouth and says, oh my gosh, they really didn't go to the moon. This proves it. And I said, yeah, when are we going to air this? And he thinks and he thinks. And he says, I can't do it. I can't do it. I don't want to go down in history as the man who caused the Civil War. So an NBC news director agreed that the tape I uncovered proved conclusively that the moon landings were fake, and he refused to tell the public who he's supposed to serve. Another 10, 20 years go by. Another NBC news director calls me up from New York, says we want to buy exclusive rights to air this footage. And then after they fly me to put me up in the Waldorf Hotel and, pay me thousands of dollars for the fee of my interview and the license for the footage, they say NASA called them up and threatened them not to air the footage.
All the original supposed moon landing footage, it's gone missing or it's degraded, is it not?
Yeah, they misplaced it. It's very interesting. Poor Ron Howard, whose own grandfather told him, Ron, the moon missions are fake. Take those rocket posters off your wall. You can see, little rockets in the background of, Opie Taylor's, room in Andy Griffith. He just didn't want to give it up. He produced Apollo 13, right? And yet he wanted to be executive producer of this IMAX movie in the 90s, showing, Apollo footage bigger and at higher resolution than had ever been shown. So he calls up NASA and says, I want the original tapes. He said, give us a few days. And between his request and when they called him back, 2 tons of videotapes disappeared from NASA's archive. It's the same, historical national archives that have like the Declaration of Independence in there. And I'm like, that's 245 years old. It's still there. How come something, 30, 40, 50 years old and weighed 2 tons and suddenly vanishes? So not only are all the original videotapes gone, so that you can never see the fake sets clearly, all of the telemetry data of where the rocket really was, it has been destroyed. And their flight director says, yeah, we intentionally destroyed it all. Why would you destroy, these important documents about the great accomplishment of the United States? Why aren't you preserving them like the Declaration of Independence? It's obviously done so to cover their tracks.
Yeah. During the course of, reading your book and the last month or so of getting into the moon landing stuff, I've obviously tried to watch and read bits and pieces on the other side of the argument. So I found myself watching a National Geographic documentary called Back to the Moon. Within the first 5 minutes, there's a couple of daft statements that the narrator makes. Firstly, he says, with a budget of $140 billion in today's money and 400,000 people involved, it would be impossible to reproduce this project today. And he just kind of moves on from that statement as if it's fact, when that's,
Well, it's not fact at all. I mean, that's the red herring they throw out. If 400,000 people were involved in making the moon rocket, you can't keep a secret from 400,000 people. Well, of course you can't keep a secret from 400,000 people. That's why you don't tell them. Do you really think the CIA is stupid enough to tell the guy who made the glove or the boot or the door handle, hey, we're really not going to the moon. Don't tell anybody.
Yeah, it's compartmentalized, the whole thing.
The flight controllers who are sitting there. I showed this, and a funny thing happened on the way to the moon. Right before I show all the rockets blowing up, they do a dolly shot past all of the consoles. This is 30 seconds before they go to the moon for the very first time. All the guys are sitting there watching television like everybody else. It's all for show. One of the controllers said afterwards, we could tell no difference from a simulation and an actual flight. That's just numbers on the screen. That's all it is. 2,000 feet from the surface, 1,000 feet from the surface, 50 gallons of fuel left, 40 gallons. They got the same information during their rehearsals. It was just on a magnetic tape being fed to monitors. Same thing during the flight. The guy said he could tell no difference whatsoever. The fact is, there's only 3 eyewitnesses and a TV picture controlled by the corrupt Nixon administration. So that argument doesn't fly. And this is one of the clips in the book. National Geographic, contacted me on their special to allegedly seriously investigate the moon landing fraud, which is a joke because they're paid for by the United States government who wants them to perpetuate. So what they're really there to do is to put out the fire of the truth coming out. So what they did, and I do a 10, 15-minute video explaining this, they go out to a desert at night with a spotlight, an electrical light. And they have a guy dressed up in an astronaut costume and have someone stand beside him. And they admit the shadows intersect at almost 90 degrees. Therefore, it's normal. And Bart Sibrel and his film are wrong. Well, actually, they're proving me right. I mean, they say we can't simulate, the intensity of the sun. Sure you can. You just wait 12 hours and film it in the same spot in the day with sunlight. If you want to simulate sunlight on the moon, shoot it during the day. Then you would have the astronaut and the guy next to him, the shadows running parallel, and it's impossible to intersect in natural sunlight. So they simulated the pictures on the moon by intersecting the shadows as they intersect in the moon landing pictures with an electrical light. So what they're actually proving is that the moon pictures were also shot with an electrical light, which means they're on the moon. So they interview me. I point this out to them and they edit out the interview because I proved that they actually proving that I'm right, all the while they're misleading the half asleep public into saying this proves that I'm wrong when it's the very evidence that proves me right.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, one of the other things routes that I went down was the people often talk about the reflectors being placed on the moon and how can it be possible to bounce lasers off if the astronauts weren't there to place them there. I mean, there's
that didn't work either. I mean, you can get a copy of Scientific American magazine, I think, from 1957. They were bouncing lasers off the moon in 1957 because there's many parts of it that are highly reflective. All they had to do is choose one of those areas as the alleged landing site, and then the Soviets proved that you can put a man-made mirror on the moon without having an astronaut. They sent a probe there so that it wouldn't be killed from the radiation. They put a laser reflector on the moon too. And then all that information is coming back to a computer anyway. So, you could simulate those numbers anyway. That doesn't fly. All their arguments, I easily dispel. And then they say, well, the Soviets and the Chinese, they would blurt out, they would tell the world. Well, no, they wouldn't, actually, if you think about it. For example, if I had a picture or video of a world leader with a prostitute, I could, give that away to the world and ruin them. But the real smart thing to do, and remember, the Soviets are chess players, they're smart, would be to blackmail the person year after year after year after year. So, yes, the Soviet Union knows we faked the moon mission. So does China. They teach it in school. They teach it in high school that the moon landings are fake. So why don't they make a big stink about it? Well, they're negotiating with the United States. We have skeletons in the closet. They have skeletons in the closet. All these trade deals are going on. When Trudeau, this criminal leader of Canada, was asked, what's your favorite country in the world? Did he say Canada? Did he say America? Did he say England? No. The Bible says, from the overflowing of the heart, the mouth cannot help but to speak. He says, China. I love dictatorships because they can get done things quickly, without all these people protesting that we're taking away their freedom. I mean, my gosh, the CIA loves China, and the CIA runs the world. And so they're buddies with China, and they're buddies with the KGB. And this whole idea that they're enemies of ours is just not true. They may be competitors, but they're not enemies. I mean, come on. We buy and we give China $2-3 trillion a year, in sales. We would be lost without them. So the idea that they're enemies, that's all make believe, like two, wrestling, opponents who are really friends, and the whole event is staged.
Yeah. If anyone wants more information on the what you were speaking about, the Soviet program, it's actually called the Lunokhod program, which put reflectors on the moon. And the experiment you were speaking of in the 50s, I believe it was Louis Smullen from Michigan Tech that actually bounced a laser off the moon long before.
Well, Matthew, you're impressing me. I mean, you have done your research.
Yeah, well,
very impressed. So, I mean, at what point? Let me ask you a question. At what point? What age were you, and what was the revelation? I was producing this, $1 million project under the theory it might be true, and I gave them the benefit of the doubt as long as possible. I pop in a tape, don't show to the public. I hear the CIA telling them how to do it, and I'm figuring it out. Then it dawns on me they're faking being halfway to the moon, which means they can't go halfway, which means they didn't come. My heart broken. What about you? At what point? What age were you when it dawned on you, wow, they really did fake the moon landing?
For certain, probably halfway through your book. But, I mean, I've always been susceptible to conspiracies generally because, for me, my worldview, it makes more sense to me to have the idea that there is the group of nefarious people pulling the strings than a consecutive series of random events which always seem to land to the benefit of a certain group of people. So probably quite young, I went to university and did a politics degree in 2005, and I was the only one there quoting from David Ray Griffin's 9/11 books. So I've always been exposed to this sort of stuff, watching X-Files when I was about 10 years old. So it's crept into my general outlook, and now I'm, you hinted at it earlier when you were speaking about the shots and what's coming and whatnot. I think people like us, it's not that I used the word susceptible before. It's not that we're susceptible. It's that we're more open-minded and willing to look at things from our own researched point of views instead of just swallowing what the TV's saying.
Let me ask another question, if you don't mind.
Yeah.
Turn the tables on you, because
that's fine. Yeah.
I'm curious, just like you. I've always been curious as a kid. How does this work? How does this work? How does this work? Do you believe in God?
I'm undecided.
Well, if you had to put money on it, someone holds the gun to your head, or an angel says, "We'll take you. We'll end your life if you're wrong now." If you had to put money on it, things made themselves, or there's some divine higher intelligence that made everything, which would you choose?
I think you can't have one without the other. I think I think you have to, once you get into the idea of there's a grand creator, you naturally next ask the question, well, who created him? And it's a perpetual cycle. I think there's so much.
Not really. That's not the case, because I used to have my favorite dog and golden retriever, and she'd hop in the car and go for a ride and, hop out and whatever. She probably knew that the car was an inanimate object. And she probably even knew that I controlled it. But if I open the engine and I say, this is the starter, this is the alternator, this is the spark plug, I could spend her entire life trying to explain a spark plug. She would never get it. Just because she can't comprehend design doesn't mean it's not true. And simply because you can't comprehend in your finite mind an eternal being that was never created doesn't mean it's not true.
Yeah, that's fair. I mean, I certainly like looking around at creatures and just the human body itself. I struggle with the idea that that's just come about by accident.
Well, yeah, it's all design. You do an autopsy. I mean, it's compartmentalized. It works together completely. Individual, and that's what this book, The Privileged Planet, talks about. It's just from mathematics and science. If you really are honest about it, it proves divine creation. Whether we have to go to the next level, what that means or not. Things don't make themselves. I mean, if a bee is entirely dependent on its life on a flower, and a flower is entirely dependent on a bee, then how could they design themselves knowing of the other unless there's some higher order there?
Yeah. It's I've certainly been toying with philosophical stuff like that recently.
Yeah, and seeing how we're gonna die anyway, and seeing how more than likely, unfortunately, a cosmic event is heading our way, and we may not even grow old. Contemplating these things now, contemplating God now and repentance now, and what do I need to do to enter eternal life? That's highly significant. That's why, to me, the greatest scripture is, what good is it to gain the world and forfeit the soul? Because these people who faked the moon landing, killed Kennedy, did the little scenario for the last 2 years, they did a fabulous job. They will gain the world, but they won't be there forever.
Sorry, only go.
Well, and other people who basically do what is right, even at cost to them. God promises to forgive their mistakes and to grant them eternal life. So, I didn't believe that the Bible was any important book until I read it. And it's pretty simple. If it were written by men, it'd be a lot more flattering than it is, because every single hero does bad things like incest and murder, adultery. And yet they're still the best that mankind had to offer, and God used them. And it's pretty simple. The one thing that convinces me that Jesus is not of the earth is when he says, love your enemy. Because the Jews are killing the Muslims are killing the Jews, and the alleged Christian Americans are killing everybody else. So loving your enemy, who would say that except a spiritual being? And, French said he's like the, painter who painted himself into the picture and just showed us the right way to live. And I think God is letting this sin go on as a divine lesson for all time. And the Bible says it will come to an end. If people don't repent, they'll be dead forever. And the people who live for what is right, even at cost, will live forever. And that's really the hope that we have. And that's really more important than the moon landing or who killed Kennedy or even the coming comet or asteroid, is living forever. There's Futurama. I love that show. And Bender, my favorite kleptomaniac robot character, he calls all of his cohorts meat bags. I'm going to live forever, you meat bags. And He says, even if I'm run over by a steamroller, they pop out my memory cartridge, pop in a new one. And then his owner says, I'm sorry there, Bender, you were made before memory cartridges. When you die, that's it. He says, how long have I got? He says, well, you may only last 1,000,000 years. And he's like, and then what? And it's like, even if the devil promised you 1,000,000 years, that last day would finally come. And then what? And then Bender said something very profound. He said, anything less than immortality is a complete waste of time. And that's the ultimate goal. That's the ultimate prize, is to live forever in a perfect world where all this bad stuff will never happen again. God promises that for people who put him first and put what is right first.
It does strike me that the bad people amongst us, living forever is one of their goals. Have you been on the website 2045.com?
No, I mean, I guess these people think they can make a computer and, or a robot body and download their consciousness into it someday. It's just never going to happen. I mean, there's just no way for anyone to know the thoughts of a person or the personality. You could simulate it. You could simulate a robot that looks like George Washington, but it's not George Washington. It's not his consciousness. Yeah. And, the devil himself may be promising some of these people eternal life, but the devil will eat his second in command to live 1 second longer. So be careful. Snakes eat their babies. So be careful.
I think this is what I was getting at in my initial question to you, which was, why the moon landing? And I think what I've established from reading your book and listening to you in podcasts is actually there is a lot more to what you're saying and your work than it just being moon landing related. But I think given your relationship with Bill Kaysing, it was probably a calling almost that you had to do this particular work. And regarding your question about my interests, I'm probably quite scattergun in that, like, I could hold a long conversation about most conspiracy theories. I actually did a diploma in conspiracy theories as well as my politics degree.
But did you know that degree, it's not really printed on actual university paper? If you put it under a microscope, you'll see that.
Yeah. Well, it's certainly been worthless in my career, I'll tell you that much for nothing. But yeah, I've been quite scattergun about these things. I probably haven't found my specific call in an area of research. I mean, hence I've cobbled together this podcast and trying to get that off the ground. But regardless, is there anything you're working on just now? Like, what's coming next?
Well, one of the reasons I wrote this book, which took me 2 years just to edit, I want to put it behind me. My true calling is to be a feature filmmaker. At least I think it is. Who knows? I want to tell a story, an important story, fictional story about the meaning of life, and using, I'm always a fan of the Twilight Zone, using kind of not exactly sci-fi, more fantasy kind of plots about it. So I've written a screenplay that may be my first feature film, and it was going to star Ed Asner. Ed Asner was a big fan of A Funny Thing Happened on the Way to the Moon. He was president of the Screen Actors Guild at one time, and he was gung-ho to be in my movie. And then he got a shot of something and died 90 days later. And so I'm looking for somebody to replace him, looking for a new investor who kind of bailed when Ed Asner died, for just $1 million to produce a feature film that could make a lot more money than that. And that's what I'd like to do. I'd like to produce that film. If you know of anybody who wants to give me $1 million, I'll give whoever puts me in touch with them a 5%, $50,000 finder's fee as part of the budget. And we'll make a great movie of a great story of basically an elderly man who was a military assassin. He would assassinate traitors, one of whom ended up being his best friend. And it haunted him all his life. And he's rejected by his family because of it. And he's dying of heart cancer. He's got 7 weeks to live. And while these strange events are going on in the world that kind of foretell the end of the world, he is, trying to make amends for all the mistakes he's made in his life. and basically changing, going from an evil person to a good person in the course of the film. All these miracles are happening to him and to other people in the world. So I hope to make that movie soon. And if anyone is inspired enough to put me in touch with an investor to help me do that, well, I'd be honored.
I suspect the way you spoke about that there, it's based on a possible real life inspiration. But I won't.
Well, you know, Mozart said when Salieri, you see this in the film Amadeus, when he saw his work, he said, may I have a copy? He said, that's the original. He said, but there's no corrections. He said, yeah, I just write what I hear and what I hear from God. And so when I write this story, I'm just writing what I see in my imagination. I'm crying as I write the movie because I'm hearing the dialogue for the first time. This man's encounters with angels who remind him of things he did when he was 12 years old, sin that he did when he was 12 years old that ended up saving someone's life. So even though it was a sin, God, the angel says, cannot be outwitted. And I felt divinely inspired to write it. The film is called Silence in Heaven. That comes from Revelation 8:1. It says, when the seventh seal is opened, there was silence in heaven. The Bible says that the angels are praising God 24 hours nonstop from the beginning of time until the seventh seal is open. The seventh seal means that the judgment on the earth can no longer be stopped. The end has come. And it brings such awe and shock and sadness to the heavenly host that most of mankind will not make it, that they become dead silent. So it's about this phenomenon that happens in the world and no one knows what it means. And the news people are trying to figure out what does this mean? And it's a sign from God that the world is going to end soon, that they have a little bit of time to change their bad ways. All the while, the main character is doing the very same thing in his life, going from a murderer to a good person. Because God forgave David for committing adultery and murdering the man who was married to her to cover it up. And God still said he was a man after his own heart. So if God can forgive murder, he can forgive anybody. The issue is, you know, in my life of 57 years, I've never seen a single news story where a criminal who had gotten away with murder or rape or robbery, you know, years earlier turned themselves in out of their own conscience. I've never seen it happen. But that's what we have to do. And really all that we have to do to live forever is to confess our sins and acknowledge that and change. So I hope that one of the astronauts will do that. Someone in the deep state will come forward. Most of the people in the government are honorable. It's just the heads of those departments are appointed by the corrupt presidents, and they're not allowed to investigate the crimes they really should. So they're not coming forward, these good people, because they're afraid they're going to lose their job and lose their house and lose their life. Well, you're going to lose all that anyway. So you might as well take a stand. Our forefathers had to do the same thing after the Boston Massacre. They said, that's enough. That's enough. We're willing to sacrifice everything for what is right. And they did fake the moon landing. They did kill the crew that would have been the first crew to go on the moon. These men had wives and they had children. And our country murdered them to cover up their crimes. That's important. The world needs to know, and God will forgive any astronaut and any murderer who comes forward. But you have to do it. Otherwise, you'll be dead forever when you have the chance of living forever.
Yeah, that's very profound. Probably the most profound thing anyone's ever said on my podcast, to be honest. Where can people find more information about you? Do you have social media? I tried to find you on.
Well, not really. I had a friend want me to do Facebook. It's just too complicated to try to censor out all the garbage that people say about you. So just go to my last name, Sibrel, S as in Sam, I-B as in boy, R-E-L, Sibrel.com, and you'll get everything there.
Perfect. I mean, I highly recommend everyone, at the very least, watches the videos that you've put out on there, and your book. It was a fascinating read, and I do hope somebody gets you that $1 million, probably $2 million. You'll need adjusted for inflation by the end of next week.
You're probably right. Probably got it right there.
Yeah, but we'll call it a day at that. Thanks for joining me today.
Sure. You take care.
Thanks, you too.
Join us next time for the Political Dark Side podcast.
It's a disaster. Whose idea was that? It's just ridiculous.
Available on iTunes, Google, and Spotify.
For more information, visit politicaldarkside.com.